concept. So thank you again for presenting for us, and we look forward to hearing about problem-based learning strategies.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joe Caniglia. I'm an assistant professor for the English department at Hudson County Community College. I'm also the vice president of the National Tutoring Association and the national director for training for the NTA. Through my years of teaching at Hudson County Community College, I see students all the time coming into the class during the beginning of the semester, wanting to do well. They're very determined, they're eager, they want to learn, but many of them lack the skill of being engaged in the classroom. Very few at times participate, and I've been researching many different techniques to help boost student engagement. And one of the techniques I came across a while back is problem-based learning. And that's going to be the focus of our discussion today. We are going to be focusing on, of course, giving you some information about problem-based learning, techniques, how to implement it in your classroom, and some sample activities that you might be able to use with your students. I'd now like to turn it over to my colleague.
Hi, I'm Lilisa Williams. I am the Director of Faculty and Staff Development at Hudson County Community College. I have been teaching for about 15 years in the classroom part-time, and I have also, like my colleague Joseph Caniglia, noticed that students are sometimes not so engaged. And I started wondering what can be done, what can we do to increase that student engagement? These students have to come to class for a good amount of time, 16, in some cases 16 long weeks. And so we definitely was interested when I heard about problem-based learning. I attended NISOT conference back in May 2017, and one of the presenters there was presenting on problem-based learning and how it was related to student engagement. And then I also attended another conference where they were also talking about project-based learning, which is also similar to problem-based learning. So that's how I got interested in presenting this topic, in addition to being a business professor and using real-world business problems to engage students. So that's been my experience, and now we want to tell you a little bit more about problem-based learning. So as Joe had mentioned, our objectives for today is to explain how problem-based learning, how it works, to identify the impact that problem-based learning can have on student engagement, and also to list some techniques and how you can incorporate some PBL activities into your classroom and to take some questions. So to get started, I would like to ask you a question and find out how you feel about this. The question is, what is your experience with using problem-based learning? So you have those choices there. You can choose that you don't know much about it, or you could say that you have heard about it, or you can say that you have used it or that you regularly use it. So just kind of give us an idea of your experience and your usage of problem-based learning. So we'll give you about 30 more seconds for you to answer those questions. Number one, to answer the question, your choices that you don't know much about it, but you're interested in learning. Number two, you have heard of it, but you haven't used it in your class. Number three, you've used this approach in your class at times. And then the fourth option would be that you regularly use this approach in your class. Okay, so polling has stopped. Okay, great. So it looks like what we can see from the results, we see that quite a bit of you that are, at least those of you who are on right now, that are listening to this webinar live, we see that about 57% of you say that you don't know much about it, but you're interested in learning, so that's great. And then another percentage of you, about 36%, says that you have heard of it, but you haven't really used it in your class yet. And about 7% said you've used this approach in your class at times, so we would be interested later in finding out what you think about the process as you have used it. And then there are some that says that you use it regularly. So great, wonderful. Thank you for taking our poll, and now we're going to move on to our next slide. So the first question here is, what is problem-based learning. So again, if this is something that you are planning to use or would like to consider using, or anything that you just want to know more about, we always start with what is it. So we've done some research, and this is what the reports show. That problem-based learning is an instructional approach to teaching that is student-centered. And that's part of the key right there. And that's somewhat different than just being teaching-centered. So it is student-centered, and it is focused on getting students engaged at various levels of learning. When properly implemented, it can create a way for students to use both critical thinking and higher order learning. The student uses problem solving and thinking skills to solve real world problems. Problem-based learning provides the opportunity for students to work individually and or in groups to solve challenging problems that are authentic and are curriculum-based. So again, we can see right from there exactly what problem-based learning is focused, and it is focused on giving students an opportunity to really be engaged in using various skills to solve a problem. But then we also want to look at, so how did it get started? That's what I wanted to know. Where did problem-based learning start? And it seems that it got its historical beginnings from the medical field. So it started somewhere around 1913. There was a concern that too much reliance was placed on lecture-based teaching and not enough emphasis on student learning outside of memorization. And a lot of people have that problem. The students, they memorize a lot of information, but then after the class is over, when possibly they would really need to be able to use the information, they couldn't remember much of it, or when it was time to really solve problems. Then by the 1950s, we see that it was integrated systems were used in teaching in the USA medical schools. They began to be seen all over the place. And then by the 1960s, problem-based learning was introduced in the Canadian medical schools. By the 1970s, many of the United States schools and worldwide medical schools began to adopt PBL practices. And by the 1990s, we had the introduction of PBL in medical schools in the UK by universities such as Manchester, Glasgow, and Liverpool. So what are the possible impacts of PBL on student engagement? I mean, that was one of the things that I was most fascinated and most excited about, because as a professor, I mean, the one thing I wanted my students to do was, in addition to attend class, I wanted them to actually be engaged in the class. I wanted my students to want to come to school no matter whether it was rain, snow, or whether it was a bright sunny day. But I really wanted them to feel as though they had information that they can use. So the research shows that these are some of the impacts that PBL can have on student engagement. Number one, it promotes an interdisciplinary approach to learning. Therefore, students are able to take information that they've learned in other courses, like, so I teach a business class. So my students can use what they're learning in their sociology class or their history class, and they can use some of the concepts that they learned there and apply them in the business class. And what I liked about that approach is it also gives me a conversation to have with faculty members from all the different disciplines and talk about how, and share with them how students use the information that they're teaching. And I think that helps students remember what they're learning too a little bit better. It also stimulates that collaborative learning approach, and that in the classroom, when students are solving problems together, they're working with each other. It necessitates that advanced higher order thinking. And when Joe comes back, you'll hear a little bit more about the ways that we get students to engage in higher order thinking. Students get involved in research from multiple sources. And that's another thing that can also keep students engaged, because students are actually being active in their own learning. It's ideal for diverse classrooms. And so there's basically there's all types of mixed, different backgrounds for students in the classrooms. And this way they get to learn from each other, they get to experience from each other, and they actually are growing. I believe they grow, right, Joe?
Yes.
And so it also creates a reverse of the teacher and the student role. And for me as a professor, it gives that diversity. So I'm not the only person, up talking. So the students are also, they're active, they're engaged, and it's not a passive classroom, but the classroom just seems more active so what I do in my business class, I usually let students work on a business problem and find solutions. It also allows students to work in teams. And this has been one of the most rewarding benefits, I think, for the students as well as for myself as the instructor, is that when I see students working together, and sometimes these students, and I will quiz them to find out if they knew each other prior to class starting. Many of them, they didn't know each other, and so they get to work in teams, and they're working to solve a common problem. So they have like a kindred spirit. Now, how successful has PBL been? Well, it's still somewhat new, especially in the type of classrooms outside of, say, the medical field, and maybe like in the engineering areas. So there's still a lot of research to be done, but what we do know and what we have found, as Himlo has stated in his research, is that PBL students generate explanations that are more accurate, more coherent, and more comprehensive than students who are not being taught using a PBL strategy. They also transfer their reasoning strategies that they are taught and are more likely to use science concepts in their explanations. This effect is stronger for the full-time PBL students. And so that's what we can say about how successful it's been. But then there are also skills that students need if they want to start using these PBL strategies. Definitely they need to be able to be skilled at teamwork, because it's not just one student. All students have to get involved. Then there's leadership. As students are working to solve problems and coming up with ideas and deciding who will research what, somebody has to take leadership. Also, the student has to have the listening skills. And even as for a teacher as well, for the teacher, you're not just up talking, but you're also listening. So you're listening to your students as well as the students are listening to each other. And as we all know in the workplace, the listening skill can really be a benefit to our success and our professional development. Then there's cooperation. There's respect for colleagues' views. That's also important. Another skill is the whole research skill. That goes a long way with students and across disciplines and in all their subjects. Independent learning. And so even though students are working in groups and they're working in teams, they are still benefiting independently for the part that they play. And they get an opportunity to see that they really have something to give. And then it also builds their presentation skills, as they have to deliver their solution to the problem to a board. In business class, we pretty much have them delivering their presentation to a board of directors or to a bank. Now I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague, Joe.
Thank you, Lilisa. Lilisa mentioned various skills that students need to adhere to when they're involved in problem-based learning. But what I found as an instructor during the past 8 years, and before coming to Hudson County Community College, I used to teach in the public school system. Like I said before, many students are eager and want to learn, but they lack the skills to engage themselves fully into the learning process. I like what Hunter Boylan states. He's a developmental ed theorist, and he believes that the learning process should be holistic. While academics are very important, skills such as organization, study skills, being independent learners, being student-centered, are all skills that students need to be successful learners. It will not only help them in the community college setting, but in life in general, because once students leave us, hopefully they will achieve their degrees and move into society and be productive members, productive citizens of society by carrying on professions, jobs, but having the skills not just to learn academically, but also to function as a citizen are very important. And what I found, which is intriguing about problem-based learning, is that students have prior knowledge about a topic, but problem-based learning emphasizes them gaining more knowledge by doing research, whereas problem solving itself uses the student's prior knowledge to solve a problem. So the difference basically is, while they're interrelated, they are also different. Problem-based learning, as I stated, involves students gaining outside knowledge to solve a specific problem. And this problem-based learning technique encourages independent learning, while it also encourages interaction with their peers. And I'll go into that a little bit later. Okay, so as we move on, the skills that are needed in this approach involves students to interact with their peers. Having prior knowledge is important, but problem-based learning is going to encourage them to learn more knowledge in addition to what they know. Woods, in 2003, developed the 7-model approach to problem-based learning. The first step, step number 1, is where students have to identify and clarify the issue that they are going to discuss. So students will be placed in groups, and we'll discuss that in a little bit. And they're going to either identify and clarify the problem, or the instructor can give each group a specific problem that they're going to solve. I like both techniques depending on the class. Sometimes if I find the class is a bit weak, I will assign specific topics for them to research. But if I find the students are more academically inclined, they're more motivated, sometimes I let them come up with a problem that they would like to solve, because that encourages self-esteem, confidence. They can use knowledge that they already have acquired. And in addition, it's amazing to see as an instructor how the students interact and help each other. This is an awesome technique. Step number 2, when they're in their groups, once they identify the problem, they're going to define the problem. Students have to, on their own, as a group, define what area they are going to research and try to solve. Step 3, once they've defined the problem, the group will brainstorm. Students will be allowed to use their prior knowledge, and it's encouraged that all students participate, and all the knowledge that they bring to the table should be accounted for and should be taken into consideration when the groups decide on what technique they're going to use to solve the situation. So their prior knowledge is very important, but what's most important is they'll be gaining new knowledge by implementing research. In step 4, it's suggested by Wood that the students review steps 2 and 3 before they get involved in the research. So they have in mind what problem they're going to be working on and the approach they're going to take to solve the specific problem. Once they do that, step 5 is they're going to formulate learning activities. Okay, learning activities, there must be, as the instructor, we must make sure that certain learning outcomes are set forth. The learning outcomes must be focused, approachable, and measurable. This is very important. So as an instructor, we're more of a facilitator, and I'll discuss that in a few minutes. But these learning goals and learning activities that are set forth, they must be measurable, they must be focused, and they must be comprehensive. So as the students are working on their papers and working on their problems that they're going to be solving, we as instructors are more of a facilitator. Step 6, students will break into different areas and they will conduct their private research. So each student will be given a specific area of research that they have to take part in. And they will split for a while, 2 or 3 days, it's suggested. I'll discuss that a little bit later. And they will conduct their private research. And after a few days, the groups will reconvene. They will discuss the research that they gathered, and what will happen is then they will discuss this research. And then after they discuss and come up with the solution to their problem, what I have students do, which I find amazing, is especially with the shy students. In the beginning, many students have an issue of working in groups, but as time goes on, the students become more engaged. Student engagement is increased, it's enhanced, and students are proud of their work at the end. They've learned a lot, and they can't wait to present their projects to the class. And as an instructor, that's what I find most rewarding. They're learning academic skills, but in addition to that, they're learning to be confident in themselves, that they can accomplish anything that they set their mind to. And that's what I admire most about this approach. So those are the 7 steps that Wood suggests in following this strategy. Okay, as I was stating before, as a teacher, as a professor, I, of course, have used some lecturing in my classroom, but I try to make it as much student-centered as possible. Problem-based learning is very student-centered, but the role of the instructor and the role of the student is a bit different. So when we're facilitating, first I'll discuss the facilitating of problem-based learning. Now, this isn't set in stone, depending on your class. Sometimes I have a class size of 25, other times I have a class size of 12. So depending on the class size, you will divide the students in a few groups. It's suggested less than 8 students in a group. If I have a class of 16 students, I will have 4 or 5 students in a group and have 3 separate groups. You can, as an instructor, depending on your class, you can assign the students problems to solve, or what I do a lot is I have students come up with their own problems that they would love to solve. For example, how to solve the problem of global warming in our society. I'm a writing and reading teacher, but students have to research this topic. They're going to have to write papers on this topic. So in addition to learning their academic skills, they're also gaining knowledge about this topic or any topic that you assign to them. It's suggested that the groups meet twice a week for about 2 to 3 hours per session. And at the first meeting I find is vital, because when the students initially meet and they're placed in their groups, they have to come together as a group and decide how they're going to tackle the problem, how they're going to solve the problem or situation that they're given. So that's vital in that first meeting, that they decide that. And then they're going to identify different issues and different questions that they're going to have to solve, that they're going to have to come across, research, and solve to get to the solution that they are looking for. Their period of individual study, I mentioned this before, when students go out to do their own research, usually 2 to 3 days they spend on intensive research. And then they come back as a group and they discuss the knowledge that they have learned through research, plus using their prior knowledge, and then the group will discuss what strategy they're going to use in order to solve their situation. I love this approach. Like I said before, education, I believe in education strongly, and I, as an instructor, am so excited when I see students come out of their shell, because sometimes they don't realize how intelligent they really are. They come into a class, and especially I find that in developmental education when I teach developmental ed. Many times our students come to us at a community college with a lot of baggage, some of them, they've been talked down to. Maybe they don't believe that they can accomplish what they set their minds to. But this approach helps them get out of their shell. It helps them engage with other students. So I really wish you would give it a try. But as far as the approach as a teacher, I would like to go into that now. We call the instructor the facilitator. Not we, research says that the instructor is a facilitator. And the instructor should have knowledge of the process. Before they implement this process in their classroom, like with anything else, we have to study the process as instructors. They have to be committed to student-directed learning, okay? They have to, because sometimes a lot of instructors use both approaches, lecture, of course, which is important, and student activities. But PBL is mostly student-directed, it's student-centered learning. And the instructor is more as a facilitator, a guide, a mentor. Okay? The instructor or the facilitator has to be able to generate non-threatening environment. Now, of course, we do that anyway, but students, I find, have the most success with this model is if the environment, if they feel safe in their classroom environment and they're able to express themselves how they feel. So if they feel non-threatened, it's going to make this process much more successful. And as I stated before, we're promoting student engagement, but at the same time, we're promoting students to think critically. Many students do not use their higher order thinking skills. And I think it's vital, not only in school, but also in life in general, because we have to be able, as adults, to solve problems when they come to us. And using higher order thinking skills is vital. Also, the facilitator has to have an ability to facilitate and not teach. Like I said before, we are more of a mentor or a facilitator. We guide and support the students. That's the role of the facilitator. The role of the student is a little bit different too. And don't be surprised in the beginning. You might feel a little bit funny as an instructor, but so might the students, because we're taking on different roles. Students have to learn to be dependable. And this is what I was mentioning before with Hunter Boylan. He believes in learning should be holistic. So being prompt to all sessions, that's a part of learning. That when the students go out and get a job, they can't come to work late. When they come to school or come to these sessions, they must be on time and present for all sessions. And we will give them the knowledge that they need of how the process works before we implement the process, of course. They have to be committed to this process. Students can't come into this strategy with lacking commitment. Students need to be committed to the process and to self-student directed learning. And they want to be actively involved and they have to actively participate. This might be a problem in the beginning, but as time goes on and students do their research and they get to know their peers, it's amazing to see how students help each other. They want to be actively involved. And that's what I love about it mostly. The classroom becomes a community. Students are helping each other learn, which I think is amazing. And they have to be willing to make constructive evaluations of themselves and their group. So sometimes some students might be doing an amazing job, while some students might start to slack, and it's up to the other students in a nice, constructive way to get them back on track. So they're learning their academics, but they're also learning how to be successful students. So any questions about the role of the student or the facilitator before I move on? Okay, let us move forward. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Lilisa now, and she's going to discuss some of the problems that have been encountered with problem-based learning.
So yes, as Joe was saying, and as we were saying earlier, that there are benefits to using a student-centered approach. There are benefits that can lead to the student having that higher order thinking and being able to be more and think more critically about their work and be more engaged in the whole learning process, right? Because at the end of the day, it is about a lot about what they walk away with when they leave our classroom and leave our institution. But like with everything, there are problems as well. So we just wanted to highlight just a couple problems that may arise as you try to implement problem-based learning in your classroom. What could happen? So for one problem could be the sheer number of students, as it is ratioed with the number of facilitators. So again, if you have a small class of about 20 students and you break them up in groups of 3, so you got about 6 to 7 students per group, and it's just that one facilitator, that probably would work very well. However, what if you have a class size of about 60 students, right? Some classes are larger and there's only one facilitator. So you always want to keep in mind that class size is important, and that could pose a problem. Or you may have a size too small. What if you only have, a small group of 4 or 5? You would want to break them up in 2 separate groups so that you can get different viewpoints on the solutions, but that may not work. So you have to consider that. That could be one problem. The other problem might be in a sense whether or not the faculty can even modify their curriculum to fit the PBL approach. Maybe your curriculum is already designed by a person, not yourself, where you know what your objectives are, you know what problems you would maybe you could give the student that would align with your course objectives and the outcomes of your course. So you would have to keep that in mind as well. Also, you would want to know how practical is it for your students to use the library or to use other technologies, using the computer and other support resources to really get to do the research that they need. Maybe they need to interview people. Maybe they need to get around in the community. If you have a problem that's of a local nature and you want your students to get around, will your students be able to maximize on those resources in order to really give their best in a problem-based learning environment? So those are some of the problems that you could encounter. Now I'm going to go over some tips for assignments if you decide that this is something that you would want to use. So these are some tips that you want to consider. So when it comes to a problem, you don't want to just give them a problem where the solution is easy, it's easy to come up with, or the solution has a right or wrong answer. So you want to keep the problem open-ended as possible. And that's what research calls use an open-ended concept. And then the other thing you want to do is you want to not only think about, the glitter of a project like normally we see students present in a class, but we also want to think about the product itself. what is the solution that the student is coming up with? How much research has gone into the solution? How much thinking? How many different viewpoints? Has there been any paradigm shifts with the students as they are working on this problem? And then also, the third tip for an assignment is to think about the content itself. Making sure that we don't let the quote-unquote bells and whistles of the multimedia type presentations overwhelm the actual content. While yes, it is important for students to present the content in an engaging way, but you don't want students to spend so much time looking for a fun visual that they're not really learning the heart of the material. And because that's what they're going to really take away with them and experience, and be able to parlay that into a real world problem, a real world solution, either on the job, in the community, or in another classroom. And now I will turn it back over to my colleague, and he is going to discuss some sample activities.
Okay. So we as instructors, when we begin our semester, we have a syllabus that we usually follow. And I know as a writing teacher, both in developmental ed and college level English, we are teaching different patterns of writing throughout the semester. So I try to, when I was doing research, to come up with different ways to increase student engagement. I could teach writing in a variety of different ways. And what I wanted to do is to encourage students to use their knowledge that they already have, plus gain prior knowledge and interact with other students. So I came across some activities that I'd like to share with you. For instance, one, and I'm looking at this PowerPoint, this is not my activity, I found it through research, but then I'm going to share some ideas that I have with you in a little bit. A local building contractor is planning to bulldoze all of the trees in a nearby forest. These are some local groups appealing to save the trees. Your job is to identify one type of tree indigenous to the area and design a presentation to convince the contractor to spare the trees based on the impact it will have on the local ecosystem. So students with this particular problem, of course, they're going to be doing research, they're going to be doing writing, but they're also going to be gaining knowledge on how can we help the environment, society in general, and they're going to come up with their own plan on how they can solve this situation. So they're going to be using their higher order thinking skills. And when students realize that they can think outside the box and that they really are not just responding to a teacher's questions with a yes or no answer, it opens up a new way of learning for them. So that's one activity. Another activity that you can give, it can be more on a personal level. The students can solve a personal problem. Brainstorm personal challenges by proximity to the learner, first by the individual, then the family, neighborhood, city, state, and so on. Then have the learner select one. Design a scale for solving it and sketch out a plan to make it happen. There's a lot of learning taking place. Even though it's something personal to the student, they have to come up with a scenario of how they're going to solve this problem or any problem that comes their way. Another area, create a photo documentary, then turn that into a film documentary, then turn it into a short ebook. Those are unique skills that will help students think outside the box, develop their higher order thinking skills, in addition to the writing of the paper. So we teach writing, I teach reading, and many of you teach in other disciplines, but the major goal I feel in all disciplines, no matter what the subject we're teaching is to get students to gain that self-confidence, that self-esteem that they need to be successful, and also to use their higher order thinking skills. I think it's vital. I think I found myself anyway that many students need to develop these skills, and this is one way for you to do it.
Critical.
I have some questions or some other activities that I could share with you. There's another activity. Reimagine the American Constitution or similar governing documents as they were designed today, okay?
That's a good one.
That's a good one because students have a special relationship, or we all do, with the Constitution. But I find many students, you know, I've discussed this in my English classes various times, a lot of them agree with some of the amendments in the Constitution and some disagree. Some don't know many of the amendments to the Constitution. So this familiarizes them with it. But also, if they disagree with the specific amendment, they should be able to come up with a solution of how they would like to change the amendment. And that involves a lot of research. It involves a lot of knowledge. And also, a problem like this would also encourage a lot of student engagement. And that's what I think is vitally important, because I found, I work with Lilisa in doing adjunct professional development workshops. And what I found, even from instructors, that the instructors, when they begin interacting with each other, they learn so much from each other. What we're giving them, the information we give them as trainers is important. But with students also, they have so many good ideas that they don't bring to the table. Maybe they're shy, a lot of them are shy, or they lack that self-confidence. But this type of activity, PBL, problem-based learning, encourages that. And the last one I'd like to talk to you about is some researchers think, this is another activity that I found, some researchers think that we can use certain types of bacteria to clean up radioactive pollution in water. That's huge. How they, right? That's a huge, that requires a lot of knowledge, a lot of skills, and not everyone agrees. Some agree, some may disagree, which is fine. Some students in the group can take the proponent's viewpoint. Some can take the con, or the opposing side. Have students use the scientific method, evaluate data on bacteria, and decide how one bacteria or a combination of them would work effectively as a microscopic radioactive pollution eater. When I first read this, I said, how can I implement this in my developmental ed program? But you'd be surprised. You would have to maybe be more of a moderator in a type of question like this, with depending on your class. But a lot of science classes, they can develop labs. They can go do research through, of course, the library. There's a lot of internet research that they can conduct, even in developmental education. Students have knowledge. They have great ideas. It's up to us to foster these ideas. And this is one approach that I found to be very successful. As an educator also, I think of different ways, like I was saying before, to improve students' reading skills. Now, reading and writing, I feel, are integrated. In order for a person to write, they need to read, and vice versa. So you can use this approach in a reading class also. Many different activities you can design. What I do with students, and I've tried it. I haven't used the PBL approach, but I'm thinking about doing it. I teach reading through music. One approach I use, one activity. And students, I let them select a song or video, and they have to research the artist and teaching main idea or supporting details. I use music. Now, an approach using PBL you could give students several articles to read, and have a problem presented in those articles where they would have to conduct the research, and they would have to try to solve a particular problem. So music is important. Excuse me. Engagement, student engagement, student interaction are all very important. I see we have a question here. Do you have specific suggestions for PBL? Okay, one of the questions I have here, do you have specific suggestions for PBL in an accounting classroom in terms of application?
Okay, thank you for that question. Since I teach just a really, really short lesson on accounting and the business course. And what I would suggest for an accounting class, definitely I would try to probably start small with using PBL in accounting. I know in accounting classes there are a lot of concepts and principles and basic formulas that students have to learn. So what I would try to do is I would try to incorporate things like understanding the balance sheet, or understanding cash flow, or understanding inventory first in, last out, and all of those concepts through solving a problem. So for instance, you could have the students go to a local business, or it may even be a local business in their family or someone they know, or it could be in the community where they live. Go into that local business and find out if that business owner has an accountant. And if the business owner says that they don't, then they could make a proposal to that business owner that they could create an accounting that they could do an accounting assignment with that, solve some type of an accounting problem. Maybe for the person, maybe the person who has the business doesn't very much use the cash flow or their balance sheet, or maybe they don't have them organized, or maybe they don't even understand how to account for their inventory, how to account for all the different things that you have to account for with your business. And so I would use that, and that would be the problem that you would solve. And what you could do is you could have the student you could have the group of students kind of look at it as, how would you solve this problem for this particular business? So it could be a small business, or you could have them, or you can make up a business. But try to make the business be realistic. So even if you were to use a major organization, like a major tech firm or a pharmaceutical company, then you could use, kind of adapt a real live scenario, because the student may not be able to go to a major pharmaceutical or a major company to talk to the CEO or the CFOs or individuals in the accounting department, but you could also create like a mock problem for them. But the key is, I believe, that it has to be a problem. So one of the problems of the business could be that they don't do their accounting at all, and they don't know where to start. All they know is they have sales and they have revenue. Maybe they know they have inventory. So maybe the students could work on putting together a type of accounting problem for them. So that's one suggestion that I could say you could do with your accounting class. Or you can even do it with, when I was in school and we did a lot of problem-based learning, we mostly use nonprofit organizations, because a lot of times they don't have the funds to hire people. Okay, great. Another question is, and Joe probably could take this one, but I'll read the question. Do you have students evaluate their own effort and their peers' efforts? And how do you handle those students who don't contribute? In other words, how do you grade PBL assignments?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So as I was stating before, in the beginning, students are given there's certain rules and guidelines that students have to follow. So for students, it's told to them in the beginning that there has to be they all have to participate in the project. Now, we say that all the time, and some don't. So some will, if they don't participate, then they're going to have to be accountable for that, and that's up to us as the facilitator. But as far as to answer your question about peers evaluating their own efforts, in the group meetings that they have, I have students do peer reviews, and they're discussing their research and their ideas that they're sharing. So I do have the peers evaluate each other, but also what I do as the instructor, when we reconvene as a class and they're in their groups discussing their topics, I will walk around as a facilitator and sit with each group for about 15 or 20 minutes. And I can make suggestions as the instructor also, because this helps too. Students are giving each other suggestions, but sometimes it's good to hear from the facilitator also. While it is a student-centered activity or strategy, it's also important for us to, as instructors, to make sure we keep them on task. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I do something like that too. So what I do when I implement a team problem-based approach in class, because I do it in my business classes, as I have students in my marketing class, where I have students looking at the real problem of not having a business plan for a business. And the way what I start out doing is by teaching students a little bit about working in groups, the whole group dynamics, and going through the stages of group development. I even go as far as to teach my students, because our classrooms just have like rows of desks or tables in a row, and they're not situated in a normal group type of setting. So structure. So what I do is I'll make students get in that structure. I'll show them that you want to sit in a circle where everyone is facing everyone, and therefore it kind of forces people to have to contribute. I also tell them that at least one of you is going to take the lead, and if you do, part of your responsibility is to, after you hear people chime in and give their ideas and give their suggestions, I also want someone then to circle back around, and if someone did not share, I want somebody to take the leadership and say, okay, so, Joe, what's your thoughts on this? Or so, Joe, how do you feel? And even if they just contribute one thing, at least they've given something. And then the other piece of it too is to make sure that students know that your part is important, that every student knows that no matter what the situation, it could be a language barrier, it could be a student feeling shy, it could be a student who, and that's the good thing about the problem-based learning. I think for us, us as facilitators, we get to do a little training up front.
Yes,
with the student. We get to teach them pretty much that you do have to come to class, you do have to contribute. And the good thing about today with all the technology, it can make it a little bit easier that students can participate, even if I know things come up, people get sick, things happen where students can't come to class, but you can still contribute, just like we do in the workplace. You still have to contribute. And then for the grading, there are some creative ways to do that. And what I recently had to do with a class, I let the students know that you will get a group project, because when you're coming up with a solution, you're going to have the solution, and you can easily check to see who all gave their input. And I just let those students know that you just have to contribute, and you won't get credit if you don't contribute. And so it just worked pretty well.
What I also found that to help with the evaluation of peers, to answer your question too, I give students, when I'm in any activity, but especially in PBL, I give the students a rubric. When they're evaluating each other's work, I have them bring in their work, their papers as they're working on them, and their groups meet. And there's a design rubric like I use to grade their papers that I have students use to evaluate each other's papers. I always tell the students, though, to be, and most of them are, I've never had a problem, to use constructive criticism, okay, when evaluating, each other. Because sometimes you don't want students to be mean to each other, and most of them are not. But also when designing the groups, because you talked about students contributing and not contributing, sometimes it's good. Depending on the class, I'll assign the groups, and I'll take some shy students and mix them with students that are very vocal. And like Lilisa was saying, not all students are going to participate equally, but they're going to be assigned a specific topic. So if students who don't speak at all start speaking a little bit, that's success for that student. It's taking a lot of students out of their shell. They start to be responsible for their paper and their research.
So, and and the other part too, because it's not just a project, but it's a problem.
Right.
And because of the way the problems are, so the problems, when we talk about problem-based learning, these problems are carefully selected. They are problems that are complex. They are problems that are a little bit messy. And so the student has to give something to, try to fix the problem.
Yeah.
You're trying to fix a problem. So it could be, for instance, I'm going to use for an example, a quick example. Let's just say it was Jersey City, New Jersey. And so you're talking about solving a problem of infrastructure. There's traffic that causes people to be late based on the truck route.
Yes.
Or based on if a train got held up. And so how can we alleviate this problem? And you talk about the funds that would be used wherever you get the resources, and it causes students to research. So, I mean, students can then find, again, because it's student-directed and because it's student-centered, so the students are really the ones coming up with
the solution,
how they will, but not only the solution, but how they will approach the problem.
Yes.
So I
Which
think
is
that's
vitally important. Okay. I hope we helped you a lot and gave you a lot of background information. We have a question we'd like to ask you at the end of our webinar, and I'm trying to, let's see, here we go. Trying to get to the question page for you. We'll be there in a second.
So I think we already took some questions, but we do have one last poll for you.
The question is, would you think about using PBL in your class? And the responses are probably not, probably, definitely, or not sure. We would like you to take a few seconds in to answer that question.
Okay.
Most of you, said definitely, probably. That's great. You know, as instructors, one thing that I found to be an effective teacher, I always have to be willing to change and try new techniques to reach my students. What I taught 10 or 15 years ago, I had to change my approach today because we have different student populations coming to college, and we have to be able to reach as many students as we can, especially now with the development of technology, all the different new tools that we have to educate students, to try to make learning fun. And that's one thing I want to mention about the problem-based learning strategy. I believe learning is vital, but I also believe learning can be fun. And what other way than to have students engaged in the learning process and to make it as fun and enjoyable as possible, but at the same time, they're learning. Students will want to come to your class. I find students wanting to come when I use this technique in my classrooms. You know, especially if I'm having debates. Sometimes I'll make debates. I'll have one group debate against another group, depending on the situation. And they want to come to class. We have another question here. What's the question, Lisa?
The question is, I have one more question. Do your PBL assignments require students to meet as a group outside of class to complete all the work?
Okay, now.
We both can answer that, but go ahead, Joe.
Go ahead. For me, I've done both, depending on the class, because sometimes at a community college, students have other responsibilities after class. A lot go to work, some have families. But I try to encourage students to meet outside the classroom. If not, I will dedicate some class times for the students to meet in the classroom. And if they want to go to the library to conduct research, I make arrangements with the library. But I do encourage outside meetings with the student. But it all depends. You know, you have to evaluate your situation. No class is the same. So, but for the most part, I have students meet outside the classroom, and it's not a problem. Sometimes what a lot of them do, they'll actually come to the school on a Saturday and meet at the college because most of our students live close to the school. They'll either that or they'll meet at a student's house. Sometimes they even go meet at a diner and they're having coffee and they're doing their work. So it all depends on, to answer your question, I hope I answered it. It depends on each class. But Lilisa, what experience have you had?
You know, I've actually done very similar, Joe. I've used a little bit of both. So I tried because I know they have other obligations and other things and going on to their other part-time jobs and families and things like that. I do make sure that I do allow time in class for them to work on their problems, on the problems that they're working on, problem-based learning. But I also like to do it in class because I want each group to see other groups working. I think that's also part of the learning process. And when it happens, it's such an engaged and active class. And so there's a lot of noise and everyone's talking. And I also like to watch and see which, in this way, I get to see which students are actually participating. I get to see how they're participating, but I know they do have to do some work outside because they cannot get all of the resources in the class. But the beautiful thing, like I started teaching back in 1997, and I started teaching my first college level course in 2002. And so what I've noticed over time is the use of technology, whereas before students didn't have technology right at their fingertips. So now, even though they're in the classroom, they can still utilize video, they can go to different websites, they can do a lot, right, from their handheld devices and or their other devices, digital devices that they bring into the classroom. So that's the one part that I know, but I do like watching them in action. I love watching them. And one of the things I really get a big kick out of is I noticed a trend. So before, when it was near time for class to end, 5 minutes till, students are already packing up their books, putting on their coats or what have you, getting ready to leave. But I noticed when I have them working on the problem, I have to tell them to leave.
They don't want to leave.
They don't want to leave. They get engaged. Yes. Well, they get engaged. And so I said, you know, that's what really got me wanting to use this whole problem-based learning as a tool for engagement. It's like, okay, so why don't you do that all class? And but then it just becomes the challenge of how do you map and align your curriculum objectives and the outcomes that you're looking for in the learning, and then for the assessment piece. So that's a whole nother piece. How do we assess how successful this is? So it's been a learning, it's been a journey And I believe the students are learning more. They say they are. I see attendance going up.
Yes.
So I think that's also an indicator that that the students are engaged.
What I also found, to answer that previous question too, I just thought of something. When students are in a group working together, they have a specific goal set in mind. They have specific outcomes that they have to come up with. And if a student is not working, the other students will take care of that by, they'll make sure they'll say, hey, John, you're not doing your part. Let's get to work. We as facilitators, and I liked what Lilisa said because I use the same technique. I go around. I like having meetings in the classroom as well because I, as the facilitator, can evaluate who's not doing their part, and then I can speak with the students. We have another question.
Yeah, I think it's part of another question, but this one has to do with, again, how do you grade the student in the group that does not participate?
Okay, so I've had this happen once or twice. Okay, and what I do initially is when I see that occurring, I privately will take the students aside after class and I will speak with the students. I will try that approach and I will try to find out if there's a problem. Why isn't the student participating? I will then encourage the student and let the student know that this is part of your grade. And most of the time that works. I also have students, each group has to turn in a group project as well as an individual outline on the specific piece that they're working on with dealing with the problem. And I grade those papers. That's part of their grade. Plus, each group has to present at the end of the semester, at the end of the project to the class. If a student, unfortunately, after using all my motivating techniques to help the student, if the student doesn't participate, like with anything else, they're not going to get a good grade. But most of the time, I haven't found it happening because students enjoy it.
They enjoy working on a problem.
Right.
It's not just about getting in a group. You're actually working on a problem. And before we get cut off here, just want to add that, so problem-based learning is, it's not, the be-all and end-all. It may not work in every single class all the time. And for me, it's always about starting small. You can always just try it, start small, and then grow into it.
It's a different way to get students actively involved. We have our contact information for them.
Like you all were actively involved here.
Thank you very much.
I want to jump in, you guys. Yeah, thank you so much, Lilisa and Joseph, for a great, informative webinar. And I want to thank Oh, yes, absolutely. And I want to thank all the participants who are taking time out of their busy day to focus on teaching and learning, which is really at the heart of what we do at a college. So thank you for your ongoing commitment to student success. And I want to alert you to the fact that we have a couple more free events, actually full-day teaching and learning events. So if you want more, please feel free to come back and come to some of our other events. We have a teaching and learning conference on December 1st, and we have a keynote presenter, Todd Zakrajsek, who's a national expert on this. And there are also several breakout sessions as well. And on December 19th, we have a first-year experience expert, Dan Friedman, coming to present on engaging students as well. So if you'd like to do any of those, you can go to our website and go ahead and register. It's just www.njstudentsuccess.com. So thanks again, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.